Nick curled up on a park bench and pulled at his jacket in an attempt to block the chilling wind. His body was cold, and his stomach begged him for food. It had been a week since he had a real meal, and it didn't help that every store was advertising Thanksgiving dinner. He would lay and stare at the advertisements of freshly roasted turkey and dressing with cranberry sauce, his mouth watering at the thought. It had been 6 years since his last Thanksgiving, but he could almost taste it. Nick had come so far from that loving home, and now the streets were his residence. When he couldn't take the ache anymore, Nick found his way to the local soup kitchen. If he had ventured there sooner, he may have been in luck, but the wares had been cleaned out by the homeless of the city hours ago, and the doors had been closed. Nick's feet shuffled down the sidewalk toward a small diner. He hoped he could find some scraps among the trash to settle the argument his body was having with his mind. His fingers plucked through rotting debris that most people would never consider consuming, but Nick was desperate. His search distracted him from everything else. A gentle tap on Nick's shoulder startled him. Most people avoided the homeless like the plague, but at this moment, Nick had been approached. He turned to face a rather well-dressed young man with clean-cut brown hair and a tailored suit. The young man's blue eyes seemed to twinkle a bit behind his cheery smile as he extended a gloved hand outward toward the far less clean man across from him. Nick shakily took the person's hand and shook it, more out of reflex than anything. He had been raised to give a firm handshake to anyone who offered. The idea felt sick when he pondered it. "My name is Benjamin," the young man said, breaking the silence.
Nick.
The older man's voice cracked. "Looks like you could use a good, home-cooked meal." Benjamin's teeth showed from behind an even bigger smile. Nick's eyes grew wide at the prospect of real food, and his stomach growled in acceptance of the offer. Before he had truly thought of his choice, Nick was guided to a small car and asked to take a seat. As soon as Nick placed himself within the vehicle, his body instantly felt warmer. The heating system poured warm air through the vents, and it was like a little piece of heaven Nick had forgotten even existed. Benjamin returned to the driver's seat and started down the road, away from the dark alley that Nick had called home for so long. Benjamin looked up to his rearview mirror. "My family has a tradition," he said. "We each find someone in need and bring them home for Thanksgiving. This year, you will be my guest." Nick nodded, half listening to the boy.
"That's nice,"
he replied. He watched out the window as the city began to disappear as the car traveled further into the more rural area just beyond it. After a 30-minute drive, the car turned right onto a path that was beset by large oak trees. Even with all the leaves plucked from the branches, they seemed ominous overhead. Nick stared up at the encroaching forest as the little car traveled deeper into it. Within a few seconds, the trees opened up again to reveal a large clearing in the midst. Standing precisely in the center of this clearing was a large Victorian mansion that had so many lights upon it, it lit the entire area around. It was like a festival of lights in the middle of nowhere. Nick's eyes scanned the beauty of it all as the car came to a stop at the back end of a large circular driveway. He looked up the expanse of steps that led to an even larger set of wooden doors that were so intricately carved, Nick knew it must have been expensive. His gaze only broke when Benjamin opened the rear door. "Here we are," Benjamin said with another smile. "Home sweet home." Nick stepped out without a word, his mouth hanging agape at the spectacle. He was guided up the steps and through the entryway. He found himself standing in a gigantic foyer with highly polished marble floors. The light from the chandelier above reflected on the stark white surface like stars. A tall gentleman approached Nick and reached for his coat. Nick allowed it to be removed, and the man gently hung the tattered garment in a closet near the front door. When the man returned, they were ushered into a large dining hall to the left of the foyer. The table sat a good 24 people, and each seat was filled, except 2. Benjamin greeted his family and introduced his guest before showing Nick to his seat. "We're so glad you could join us this evening," Benjamin's mother stated with gentleness.
"Yes, it is so good to share this holiday with people who truly know what it means to be thankful,"
the father replied with a much deeper tone.
Thank you.
Nick's voice came shyly, not sure of how to take all of this in as he took his seat. For every well-dressed man or woman, there was a person of lesser dress to their side. Benjamin had been right. Each family member had plucked someone from the street to share their Thanksgiving dinner. He wondered how he had never heard of such a thing. Certainly an act of such generosity would get some sort of media attention. He silently reserved to the fact that he would have to make sure these people were commended for their caring act. Each of the homeless around him sat, eagerly awaiting their meal, and within 15 minutes of idle chatter, the first course was brought to the table. Plates of mashed potatoes with gravy, corn pudding, green bean casseroles, and the like were staged about the table, and as they were served, the needy dug in quickly. Nick was no exception. His body almost acted of its own will as the portions were shoveled from the dinnerware to his waiting mouth. A young girl in dirty clothes finished quickly and asked politely for more. The hosts were eager to share their wealth of food with her and anyone else who asked for more. The second course included a perfectly roasted turkey, glazed ham, and dressing with cranberry sauce. Just the sight of it made Nick swell with excitement. The second plate went down just as quickly as the first, and his stomach was close to bursting. A cart was brought, adorned in silver plating that reflected the light of the room around them. One by one, lids were raised to reveal desserts of every imaginable variety. There was pumpkin pie, chocolate cake, red velvet cake, cookies, ice creams, puddings, and cobblers. Nick almost fainted at the thought of so much food in one place. His eyes rested on a steaming plate of apple pie. He licked his lips as a big slice was placed in front of him. His fork dug in and pulled free a hunk of spiced heaven that was almost as big as his mouth. He laid it delicately on his tongue, and Nick's eyes closed with joy. A tear even rolled down his wrinkled cheeks at the taste. All of them had filled themselves to the point of barely being able to move, and could only hope this miracle could hold them over until their next meal. As the plates were cleaned and the table cleared, the family that had hosted them all took their wine glasses. The father rose and smiled at their guests as he toasted to the family and their tradition. He gave a small speech about being so thankful for his family and friends like the ones they shared this night with. He then turned to his wife and the rest of his family and asked that everyone at the table give thanks for one thing in their life that they truly felt blessed for having. Each one took their turn, stating things like friends, family, jobs, security, and their mutual love. The father then asked their guests to do the same, and received more meager replies like warmth, food, clothes, shelter, and a repeating statement of, "this meal." The father gave a hearty chuckle.
Well, yes, of course.
"Can we play the game now?" a small boy near the end of the table squeaked.
Soon. We have to explain first,
the father replied. The boy plopped in the mother's lap and pouted. "Okay," he said.
You see, my friends, we have one more family tradition.
The father stepped to Benjamin and patted him on the shoulder.
It was Benjamin's idea when he was younger, and we have enjoyed it ever since.
"Now that you are full and rested in your seats, we are going to play a game," Benjamin said while standing. "Yes, the person who brought you will give you a choice, and you must make it," the mother said sweetly. Nick had always liked party games and shifted in his seat a bit to see what this one would be. Benjamin rounded Nick's chair and leaned down with that same smile. The rest of the family stood as well and stood by their respective guests. Nick listened intently as Benjamin whispered in his ear the choice he would have to make. Nick's smile quickly faded as he pushed himself away from the table. His body shook as he slowly rose from his chair and looked around the room at all the frightened faces that had just learned the truth. The room almost started to spin at the notion of what he had been asked to do. All of them jumped as the doors around them were bolted shut, and the younger guests began to cry for help.
Yes, that's right,
said the father.
You must either kill yourself or everyone else. Those are the only two ways you are leaving this room.
Benjamin placed a pocket knife in Nick's quivering hand. Good luck. The family disappeared out of the remaining open door as the homeless inhabitants attempted to flee. They were shoved back by guards armed with submachine guns and instructed to remain in the room. Their only means of escape was slammed shut, and the sound of clanking metal signified their entrapment. Nick stared around the room at half a dozen men, 4 women, and 2 children that couldn't have been older than 15. Each of them had been handed some sort of weapon, mainly pipes and chains. Nick seemed to be the only one to wield a knife, and he hoped that would give him an advantage. He didn't want to kill anyone, but he wasn't ready to die either. The children scrambled to the corner of the room and attempted to open one of the doors. One of the women followed and struggled with a doorknob. A large man across from Nick pulled a length of chain around the neck of a smaller man beside him. The small body lifted from the ground, and a sickening crack echoed in the dining hall a few moments later. The sound caused one of the women to scream. Nick backed up to the wall and watched as a brawl ensued among the remaining men. It was a flurry of punches and swinging weapons. Nick stared in awe of the brutality for a few moments, before he felt the broadside of a piece of wood come crashing into his knee. Nick fell to the floor, grasping at his aching joint. One of the men stood over him, ready to strike again, but Nick quickly shoved the knife through his Achilles tendon. The floor was painted red as the man squealed in agony. Nick grabbed the 2x4 and used it to get back to his feet. 2 of the men across the room were on top of the children in the corner, punching them repeatedly in the head. The woman that was with them had attempted to protect them, but her failure left her lying limp with a large gash in her forehead. The entire room had been stained with their misfortune, and the sight left Nick quivering in place. The entire ordeal may have only lasted a few minutes, but to Nick, it felt like hours. The 2 women had clawed and scraped at each other before being silenced by a lead pipe to the skull. One of the men had attempted to take his own life by hanging himself from the light above the table, but his weight was too much for it. When the body came crashing down onto the large wooden table, his legs snapped, exposing bone. His wails of agony drew the attention of another man, who simply smothered the screams with his hands. The man on the table struggled for a short time, but when his oxygen ran out, his body fell limp on the table. Then, there were only 2 remaining, and Nick broke from his trance to notice the other man circle the table and approach him. Nick gripped the knife tightly within his hands, thinking of what he would be forced to do to survive. The man picked up one of the lead pipes from the floor and began licking his lips like a predator preparing for a meal. Nick leaned on his good leg and kept the knife at his side. The man hadn't noticed the weapon yet, and that was what Nick hoped for. The man swung the pipe, and Nick leaned out to dodge it, losing his balance and falling to the floor. His attacker took another swing, and Nick used his good leg to drop a heel into the man's knee. Nick rolled to the side as he did this, avoiding the falling pipe by inches. The man tumbled to the floor, attempting to grab Nick in his fall. Within seconds, the large man was on top of Nick, squeezing at his throat. Through struggled breaths, Nick fought to break free, but the man's weight was too much. When there was no other option, Nick shoved the knife upward into the man's throat. He forced the blade in repeatedly, and his hand was soon soaked with blood. His attacker continued to grip Nick's throat for a few moments, before finally falling on top of him. The warm liquid soaked Nick's clothes, and the feeling was sickening. Salty specks of his remorse coated his cheeks as he shoved the lifeless body off of him. He sat up, sobbing at his actions, as the doors unlocked and the family returned. They all clapped enthusiastically for the winner of their grotesque contest. "So, what are you thankful for?" Benjamin said as he approached his champion. Nick turned his eyes to the young man, seeing the smile that he had mistaken for generosity earlier in the night. All of them had been used as pawns, and though they were of the streets, they didn't deserve this. Nick used the piece of wood again to get to his feet, still holding the knife. He began hobbling toward the door as the family watched. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of an answer. He simply wanted to leave. He had almost reached the exit when the father stepped in front of him.
"We can't just let you leave,"
the father said, holding his hands up to stop Nick. Nick's eyes grew wide.
But you said..."
Benjamin slapped Nick on the back. "We said the only way you were getting out was if you killed yourself or everyone else in the room." The words hit Nick like a ton of bricks. He had been fooled into playing their little game with no chance of reward. His mind swam with the images of what had transpired within that dining hall, with the realization of how pointless it all was. He wished desperately he had never accepted the invitation, but it was too late for that. He had to figure out how to get out of this place. As he contemplated an escape, Benjamin rounded his side, still brandishing that stupid smile. That's when the idea surfaced. He grabbed for Benjamin, sliding an arm around his throat while holding the knife up to it with the other hand. Benjamin struggled while his family screamed for his release.
"Now, you're going to let me out of here, or Pretty Boy is joining the rest of them,"
Nick snarled as Benjamin fought to be free. Nick pressed the blade harder against the young man's skin, drawing a sliver of blood. The family backed away as the two started forward. Nick had to use the boy's weight for support, pain still surging from his damaged knee. Any resistance from Benjamin only caused Nick to pull tighter. They slowly backed out the door and toward Benjamin's car. When they reached it, Nick demanded the keys, which Benjamin hurriedly freed from his pocket. The family stood at the front steps as Nick leaned back against the car and shoved the young man towards the steps. As Benjamin fell to the ground, Nick shuffled his way to the driver's seat. Again, he was bathed in warmth within the car, but he had no time to savor it. He shoved the car into gear and forced his foot down on the pedal. The father rushed to help his son to his feet as the car disappeared through the trees and into the night. Nick didn't stop until he was far from the city, certain that the family would have reported the car stolen. When an hour had passed and he hadn't seen anyone following behind, he pulled to the side of the road and wept. The radio had been playing the entire time, but he hadn't noticed a word coming from it. The announcer broke the music to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. Nick's eyes turned to the radio as the voice spoke again. "What are you thankful for this year?" Nick whispered into the night.
"To be alive."
What's up, everybody? Lone Wolf here. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to tonight's video. In case anyone is interested, all of the various elements used in this video, including pictures, music, sound effects, and stories, will be linked in the description below. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new video. If anybody has any personal stories or story recommendations for me, or any advice to help improve the channel, there will be links to all of my social media platforms in the description. I'm mostly active on Twitter and on Instagram, but I also have an email, a Discord server, and a TikTok account that you can message me on as well. Until next time, stay spooky. And remember,
The hunt begins when the moon is full.